Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our discussion series on Why Would I Believe That? Looking at whether it makes logical sense to believe in a creator or not. And I appreciate your being with us. For those of you who've stuck with us every week, I hope that it's been a valuable or profitable study for you so far. And I really appreciate that and all the encouragement that you've given in this. If it's helpful to anybody, then it will have been well worth the effort to put this together. And I appreciate your sticking with us. We're coming into the last few weeks of our discussion series, and hope that we can put it all together again in a way that makes sense so that we all have a reason to know what we do or don't believe. We're picking up, last week we largely finished the third question of the four that we've been looking at. Of course, the overall question we're looking at that every person needs to consider: does it make sense to believe that there is some kind of a superior entity who designed and created or not? And so we've broken this down, just in my way of thinking, into four questions in sequence that need to be explained or answered. Each one of them either by the action of a superior entity who designed and created, or without any such intervention by random events in a completely naturalistic and materialistic way. So we've looked at some detail at the first three of those questions, and we'll begin in a few minutes here with the fourth one tonight. Just to give a very quick recap of last week's part 8, we looked at what defines life at the most fundamental level and saw that even the most primitive, you might say, organisms are extremely complex and show an intricacy of design and function that is just really hard to explain. We looked at one theory for this, one materialistic or atheistic theory for this, called panspermia. I mentioned to you that it was put forth by Sir Frederick Hoyle and his colleague Chandra Wickramasinghe. I didn't mention to you last week, but also Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of DNA, also was a proponent of this. It is generally rejected because it doesn't really explain things. It says that life landed here from another planet, perhaps. But we talked about that in some detail. I'm just going to run through this in case you want to know what was there in reference to run back to it. We looked in at one of the ideas of abiogenesis, that is the formation of a living organism from completely non-living material without the intervention of any superior entity or any direction, etc. We looked at one of the kind of sub-hypotheses of that in that that somehow RNA molecules formed and started becoming more complex without, again, just by random chemical events, and we looked at the difficulty of that. We also looked at another one of the competing sub-hypotheses of that, that somehow there were molecules that started carrying on metabolism by themselves and then eventually formed RNA, etc. Well, we looked at all of those, and just in recap, here's what we found. No matter how you try to explain this purported mechanism or sequence of abiogenesis, there are some problems with that. No matter all of the different competing sub-theories for that, and none of them agree, and none of them really think that the others are very bright at all, but they all have some of the same problems. That is, namely, there's no evidence to support any of the ideas. And I mean not one bit of objective evidence by observation or experimentation. And that's after about 70 years now of very dedicated, very intelligent, intensive experimental effort. There's still no evidence for any of it. The only thing you can conclude from a scientific standpoint is it doesn't happen, and it didn't happen. You can't get it to happen. And it doesn't matter what order, if you say RNA first, metabolism first, it doesn't matter. You have to get all of them to happen eventually all together, but in fact, you can't get any of them to happen. And no one can come even close to explaining even the smallest piece of it. It remains a dead end at every turn, despite some really, really eager and good work on it. We also looked at the need for a ribosome, a very complex intracellular organelle that has to be present in order for the cell to produce or replicate anything, including itself. So we talked about that and the kind of insurmountable problem that represents. So it doesn't really matter how you try to slice abiogenesis. All the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that none of it ever happened at all. And the only details missing, as I said, that are still missing at this point are all of them, every single one of them. So we spent some time looking at that and looked at then what a few people had concluded with this. Francis Crick, again, now he was, I will tell you, was an atheist, and I am very careful not to misquote people or to quote them out of context. I'm not trying to tell you that Francis Crick believed in a creator of any type. He didn't. He was an atheist. But he did make some honest observations that are quite illuminating. Look at what he says here. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. That is to say, there is no good naturalistic or atheistic explanation for it. Now, he still clung to atheism. He saw the obvious problem and acknowledged it and explained it, but was certainly not willing to look at the possibility that, well, maybe there is a designer or superior entity involved. We looked at some other ones too, where once again people have suggested, well, yeah, it does look impossible, but maybe if there are multiple universes, then, well, sooner or later it would have happened in one of them. And so I finally wrapped up with asking, at what point do you finally acknowledge the falsity of a hypothesis and just say, this is a dead end, it just didn't happen, this is abiogenesis, and start considering the alternative hypotheses, including maybe the ones you don't want to think about. And here's where we wrapped it up then. From Harold Urey, the Nobel Prize winner and the mentor and professor overseeing the famous Miller-Urey experiment, this from an interview that he did in January 1962, and it really wraps the thing up in a nutshell. Look at what he says. All of us, and by the way, Dr. Urey believed that there might be some kind of entity out there, but if there was, that he was completely uninvolved in our universe and our existence. So for all practical purposes, he did assume a completely naturalistic or atheistic explanation for why we're here. So again, I'm not trying to misrepresent him at all, but look at what he says. All of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe, as an article of faith, that life evolved from matter on this planet. It's just that its complexity is so great, it's hard for us to imagine that it did. So he says, yeah, it's really just not believable at all that this happened by itself, but it did. We're going to believe that as an article of faith, no matter how nonsensical it may be. And this is from a brilliant man, an unbelievably brilliant man. So we wrapped up that third question, the initial appearance and survival of life. There is the hypothesis that there was a God who created it, or that it was abiogenesis, and there's still no mechanism or prevailing theory for that, but none of them work. Or that it landed here from alien placement or a meteorite impact from somewhere else in the universe, which does nothing to explain how it arose there. Those are your choices, and we went through the fact that only one of those has any explanatory power whatsoever. Well, it brings us then to our fourth question, and again I'll note, abiogenesis, that is the idea that the earliest life, living organism arose from organic, non-living matter and elements, etc. That is not the same thing as evolution. That's the separate question that we're going to begin looking at tonight. But they are sometimes grouped together, those two, as the general theory of evolution. Okay, so when some people say evolution, what they mean is abiogenesis, the initial appearance of life by random events from dead material, and the evolution of that life to what we see now, including humans. But they're really two separate questions, two separate phenomena, and they have to be evaluated separately. You can't let one stand or fall on the strength of the other. But it's quite obvious, if you're going to have a completely naturalistic explanation of current life, then both of them had to occur in sequence. So you couldn't, without explaining both of them, you can't have life as we see it without the action of some superior entity. So that brings us then to our fourth major question or phenomenon for evaluation, and that is the diversity and complexity and precision of function of life that we see on earth now. Every plant, every animal, the human being, your pet, etc. That's the fourth and final question that we want to look at in this quest to see, does it make sense that there is a superior entity who designed and created, or does it make more sense that there could not be such an entity? Well, here are the alternatives then that we're about to plow into. There is, of course, the intelligent design and creation hypothesis. We've gone through it, but we'll look at it again in a moment, that there was a God who created all of this and created it the way He wanted it and gave the complexity and precision of life that we see, right? There is another hypothesis that's kind of somewhere in between called theistic evolution, generally the name for it. And there are a surprising number of people, you might be surprised at the number of people who do believe in theistic evolution. This is the idea that, yes, there is a superior entity who probably created the universe and ordered it the way that it is, otherwise it just couldn't be, and who probably created the first primitive life, just some single-cell organism, and then He let it go and to see what it would do, and He let evolution take place so that He was the original creator, but not a specific designer of life that we see. So it's kind of a hybrid between the atheistic theories of life, including evolution, and the idea that there is a creator, theistic evolution. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on in our discussion to see if that one makes sense. All right, but of the atheistic or completely naturalistic theories, we really have one main one and then another that's kind of a subset of it. So evolution, and that's the word that most of us know it by, that's the primarily and widely held hypothesis for the explanation of life as we see it. Also called macroevolution, although most people just call it evolution. Of course, we'll see all these terms so that you have a good grasp of everything we're talking about. Also sometimes called neo-Darwinism, okay, by natural selection from mutations. We'll get into it, of course, but the idea is that as genetic mutations occasionally occur when cells replicate themselves, and those are almost universally deadly or harmful, but the idea is that every once in a while, one of them just fortuitously turns out to be really good for the organism and creates a new function or a new anatomic feature, etc., that gives that organism a survival advantage, and therefore, in the natural selection process, it tends to prevail over other organisms that don't have that mutation and don't have that feature. So in general, that's the hypothesis. We'll look more at it, of course. And that's the widely prevailing one that we see these days, usually from an atheistic standpoint, in that this is the fourth thing that happened without a superior entity. The existence of the universe, the precise order and arrangement of the universe, that initial appearance of life from dead matter, abiogenesis is the theoretical name for it, and now the evolution of that life to complex life, and diverse life as we see it, all by random, unguided events without any superior entity. All right, an alternative to that, still on the completely naturalistic or atheistic side, would be something called punctuated equilibrium. And we'll look at that. And that is kind of a sub-theory, you might say, of evolution. And the old theory is classic Darwinism, and we'll show you exactly what that means. All right, so those are kind of our choices. And just again, as a reminder, we looked at this back, I think, in part 4 of our series. But what is the superior entity or intelligent design hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, okay? I'm not even saying it has to be the God of the Bible, just an entity who created and designed. All right, so the idea there is a supernatural, okay, above just natural processes, eternally existing entity who created all that physically exists, the universe, the matter and energy in it, etc. And this entity created the laws of nature or the laws of physics, and therefore alone has the power to override those laws if desired, since he's the one who made those laws, and they wouldn't be laws if he hadn't made them. So that's the idea of the intelligent design or superior entity hypothesis. So that certainly is a widely held and leading hypothesis about how life got to be the way that it did. Well, let's look at those others then. And this is where we want to really dig in. And again, although we'll do this, we'll take either 2 weeks or if we need to, possibly 3 weeks to really give some fair consideration to this whole idea of evolution. We will have to do it even in that amount of time. It'll still be just the briefest overview. But as always, it's my intention to make it a thorough enough and very honest and accurate overview so that if you want to go read more, you'll know where to go and what to do. But you will know the concepts and the terms that are relevant here, and you will understand them. There's no doubt about that. It's not hard to understand. Some of it may be hard to fathom on either side of these hypotheses, but it's not hard to understand. All right, so here was the original evolutionary hypothesis as put forth primarily by Charles Darwin and some others, as you'll see. It's also called gradualism in some cases. But here's the idea, that once some primitive life existed, and it doesn't, again, it's a separate phenomenon. The evolution theory in its purest form doesn't try to address how that original life got there, whether by random events or by a creator, as in theistic evolution. It just says, okay, let's say we've got some kind of life, a simple organism, which of course we know is not simple at all. But once that primitive life existed, it underwent a long and never-ending series of random changes. Now, again, this doesn't speak of genetic mutations because Mr. Darwin didn't know anything about those. Nobody did. He couldn't have. So it underwent a long series of random changes, gradual changes, some of which proved beneficial, as we said. Most of them would not. The organism usually would just die because it wouldn't survive a change. But some of them proved beneficial, and thus they were preserved and propagated by natural selection processes because they conferred a survival advantage to the organism that they occurred in. And so these occasional gradual changes eventually gave rise, they were held on to, and they eventually then gave rise to greater and more changes, and finally the appearance not only of new functions, new anatomic features, etc., but of entirely separate new species of life, plant and animal both. So that was the idea originally put forth. So that's the old theory of gradualism, or the original Darwinism of evolution. Now, what we speak of these days when people say evolution, it's neo-Darwinism or macroevolution, okay? And it is really just an updating and expansion of that hypothesis based on newer knowledge, DNA, genetics, etc. So you'll notice it's very, very similar, but it's just got a little bit more specificity to it. Here it is then. Once primitive life existed, it underwent a long and unending series of genetic mutations, some of which proved beneficial. We know that most of them are not beneficial. They're either deadly or harmful or sometimes neutral. But let's just say that every once in a while things got really lucky and that mistake turned out to be an improvement. So some of them proved beneficial, and thus they were preserved and propagated by natural selection processes, again, because they conferred a superiority, a survival advantage to that organism. So these eventually gave rise to greater changes, more complexity, added genetic material, because we have a lot more chromosomes and genes than some of the simpler life forms, and the appearance of new species. So that's neo-Darwin, that is new Darwinism, or macroevolution. So the idea is exactly the same. It's just that we now can conjecture more than what Mr. Darwin could have at the time that he lived. All right, I mentioned to you that there is kind of a sub-hypothesis here, and we'll come back to it, but I'm just going to go ahead and let you know what it is. It's called punctuated equilibrium. And this was put forth by Dr. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge. And this is kind of a variant within the current evolutionary belief. And so we will specifically address that because they noticed some real problems with the evolutionary theory and said, no, that doesn't work. Must have happened this way instead. So we'll take a look at that. It's very valuable information, and you want to know about that. So as we said, abiogenesis is the purported theoretical process by which, an unknown process still obviously, by which dead matter turned into some kind of original living organism and then went through an evolutionary process to become what life is today. So as we get further into this, I want to again tell you something that I said at the very beginning of our series. And I'm very emphatic about this. I hope that you agree. I would respectfully suggest that every person, no matter what you think you believe, every person needs to give serious, respectful, and critical thought to the evolutionary theory. You need to understand the theory. A lot of times people will claim, well, if you don't believe it, it's just because you don't understand it. And a lot of people don't understand it. You need to understand it before you can decide whether you think it makes sense to believe or not. Okay, that's just basic. So I think you need to understand the evolutionary theory. And then you need to evaluate whether it meets logical criteria for being believable or not based on science, evidence, logic, and common sense. It is permissible to use common sense in conjunction with all those other things. Okay? You need to understand why many people hold the opposite view from you, whatever that is. If you believe that evolution does make sense, you need to understand why a lot of people don't think so. If you don't think evolution makes sense, you need to understand why a lot of people do accept it. Okay? That is necessary, I think, for all of us. And whatever you decide about it, believable or not, you need to be able to make an intelligent, cogent argument which supports your conclusion without attacking the character or the intelligence of anybody else who might disagree with you. That is so lacking, I'm afraid, in the world. There are way too many people who believe in a creator who think that atheists are really bad people, or they're immoral, or they're just, unrighteous, etc. And a few of them are, but most of them are not. Most of them are decent people trying to figure out what to believe. There are way too many people who accept atheistic or naturalistic theories, including evolution, who think that anybody who believes in a God is some kind of a stupid moron, an ignorant, willfully ignorant hillbilly. That could not be more wrong. And both of those things are just totally out of place if we want to have any kind of a decent discussion. We ought to at least be able to treat each other in a civilized fashion. No ad hominem attacks from either side. They have no place. So I hope you agree. All right, well, let's take just a quick look at some historical perspective on evolutionary thought. The name that you know is the gentleman on the right-hand side of the slide there, Charles Darwin. That's the name everybody knows. And he certainly did have a lot to do with putting together this theory or hypothesis, proposal, etc. He was not the only one, but it almost universally bears his name. Some of the early writings of his that began to formulate this thought were included in Voyage of the Beagle. And then the book actually had a little bit longer title than that. It was Her Majesty's Ship Beagle. Mr. Darwin was an Englishman, etc. But that's kind of the name that it got reprinted under from 1839. And it was a lot of his careful observations and notes on different, especially animal species that he saw during some voyages on this ship, the Beagle, especially in the Galapagos Islands, but some other places as well. Well, in 1858, Darwin did a joint publication with Alfred Wallace, who had independently come up with this kind of same idea, very, very remarkably similar to Darwin's idea, and each of them came up with it evidently independently. Now, there is some thought that Mr. Darwin may have appropriated some ideas from Wallace and put his name on them. I don't know, and I've not spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. That's really not my purpose. But at any rate, they did put out a joint publication in 1858 because they had seemingly independently come to some of exactly the same ideas. Well, and there's interesting history about that too. There is some thought Darwin did not want Wallace getting credit for this, etc. I don't know. But at any rate, you can read about it if it interests you. But in 1859, Darwin then released probably what is his most famous work on the origin of species, in which he really elaborated on this idea as much as would have been possible with the knowledge of his day. And then in 1871, he had another publication, The Descent of Man, which kind of elaborated more of his thoughts on how this might have happened, etc. So Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, is the name that is just almost universally attached to the hypothesis or theory, etc., of macroevolution, and even now with more knowledge, still, as we said, called neo-Darwinism, or simply just evolution. And if we just say evolution, you'll understand that we're talking about the latest iteration of the theory that he put forth. All right, so there was some later augmentation of his theory, as we've alluded to. The term neo-Darwinism that I've mentioned to you, or New Darwinism, was first put forth by George Romanes in 1895. Now, of course, they still didn't have a whole lot more scientific knowledge of genetics and heredity at that point, but they did know a little bit more. It was Julian Huxley in 1942 who came up with the modern synthesis of evolution, he said, with kind of the latest findings. Now, this was still 10 years before the discovery of DNA. So there's ongoing revision of the theory with the discovery of DNA, genes, the human genome, etc., mapping the genomes of other species. So it's a constant revision of the theory to update it with that, but you get the picture. If we just call it evolution or neo-Darwinism, that really kind of means the same basic idea that Darwin put forth, but now with a little bit more explanation of how genetic mutations take place, where they are located, etc. All right, as we look at it then, here's what I want us to do. Now, let me tell you again, even though, of course, I reference and present to you the work of others, and I always try to give proper references for that and give full credit to that anytime I do that. But I'll just tell you the analysis, the ordering of thought, the structure of our study here, for better or worse, that's mine. I'm not giving you what I read in anybody's book. In fact, you'll find that my approach to it is probably quite different from others you'll read. Now, the reason I'm telling you that, and it might not be as good as some others you'll read, but it makes sense to me. And so that's why I've tried to order it and think of it in a logical progression that makes sense to me, and I hope is an honest and logical progression for you as well. But the reason I tell you that is, you can read a whole lot of people who have spent decades longer than I have looking at this, people who have greater scientific credentials by far within some of these areas than I ever will, and you might like their analyses better than mine. I don't doubt that at all, because they may put it forth to you in a way that just makes more sense to you, or it's easier to follow, etc. I don't know. So I'll just tell you, for better or worse, and I'll sign my name to it and stand behind it, the thoughts I'm going to give you as we go through this, they are ordered just as per my own mind. And I would love to hear your critique on whether they were presented in a logical sequence and progression or not. And as I've always said, if you can find a logical flaw in my thinking and presentation, you can find where I've made a mistake, then I eagerly want to hear from you, because I need to know that. And I will give very serious consideration to anything like that you might present to me. So here we go with this then. For better or worse, here's my thinking and the way I want us to look at this. First of all, we'll look at the unique premises and treatment of this evolutionary theory, because it's quite different from the way any other scientific or science-related theory has ever been treated. As I'll show you in a minute, I really have to hand it to Mr. Darwin and his thought followers, etc. They have pulled off an amazing feat of inverting the usual scientific thought process. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. Second, I'm going to look at the foundational assumptions of evolution. And many people just don't realize these things. They've just never thought about it. They've maybe never heard anybody say it, etc. And I've never read it in this exact form anywhere else either. And I realized I've got to figure this thing out and make it make sense before I can decide whether it makes truth sense or not. I've got to at least put it in a logical order and understand it. So we'll look at those. We will then look at critical analysis of the evidence for or against the evolutionary theory. And that's going to be not in 6 lessons, please. I'll scare you off. You'll turn it off right now. No, not in 6 sessions, just in 6 parts of the logical way that we want to look at that evidence. And that will incorporate a consideration of the idea we mentioned called punctuated equilibrium as well. All right, and then finally some concluding analysis after we've done all of that and consideration of the idea of theistic evolution that we mentioned. The idea that there was a God who created, but then he did not direct the development of life. He let it take place by an evolutionary process after creating the simplest life. So that's kind of the order that I want us to go with our thought tonight. And in the coming also next week and possibly the week after. Well, let's start, like I said, there is a very unique premise and treatment of the evolutionary theory, quite different from the way any other scientific proposal has ever been treated. Well, I'll take that back. There is one other one in very, very modern history that kind of gets treated the same way, and that is the idea of anthropogenic or man-made global warming. There's a lot of similarity in the way that these two ideas get handled. And I'm not trying to be political with that at all, but it's undeniably there's a lot of overlap there. All right, but never mind that. Let's take a look at the way evolutionary theory tends to get handled. Here's something, every one of these then is something very, very unique that doesn't usually happen this way. Okay, here we go. The hypothesis of gradualism, the original Darwinism, it was originally formulated and proposed, put on paper in the mid-1800s and promoted after that without any evidence to actually suggest it. Here's what I mean. And that is a contradiction of the usual scientific method. You may remember quite some weeks back we looked at what the scientific method is. The method that should be used anytime it can be used. Well, the very first step of it is if you're going to put forth some hypothesis on something, there ought to be some kind of evidence to suggest your hypothesis. It's not just that, you say, hey, I was sitting around and I thought of this, okay? That's not the way that's supposed to work. It's supposed to be, I've noticed this, and I'm trying to understand how does this happen, and so therefore I have formulated this possible explanation for what I see. But in this case, what Darwin saw was a lot of diversity of life, and he saw a lot of organisms that were very nicely adapted, you might say, to their environment, food supply, etc. None of which actually suggested the theory that he put forth. So it was promoted originally without any evidence that would specifically suggest his theory. Okay, I'm not saying that what he saw was inconsistent with evolution. No. Just saying there was nothing about it that specifically would have said, okay, yeah, we've always believed this was created and that just doesn't work. So, but it does tell me that it evolved. No, there was nothing there to say that. Okay, now, that part of it, as you've heard me say with some other things, yeah, it doesn't fit the scientific method, but I'll almost say, so what? He put forth the hypothesis. I don't really care why he put forth the hypothesis as far as trying to understand it or evaluate it. He did, and it's there, and it's a serious hypothesis, and it's widely held. It's believed by a lot of people. That doesn't make it true or not true, but it does make it worthy of my consideration and yours. So this is quite unique. This was not, a problem in search of an explanation. This was an explanation in search of a way to make it fit something. Okay, quite backwards. But nevertheless, I'm okay with that. Let's consider it anyway. Now, further though, it was in opposition, his hypothesis of evolution or gradual changes, it was in opposition to an overwhelmingly apparent alternative. That is, wow, all of this life looks like it was designed by somebody. That's the overwhelmingly apparent hypothesis. It sure looks like it was designed, in fact, quite intricately and carefully. That is so overwhelmingly apparent, even to atheists. That's not to say they believe it, but it sure looks that way. We'll see some evidence of that. That you would have to really go out of your way to not think that as your first inference. So we'll come back to that idea too. But in this case, where even though there is a glaringly apparent explanation for this, that it appears to be designed, it really, 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 really appears to be designed, whether it was or not. But we're supposed to reject that one right out of hand and say, no, couldn't have been designed, can't consider that. But wow, we see extraordinarily ordered information here and extraordinarily precise construction of these living organisms. So that implies to me that it happened at random. Well, no, that wouldn't imply to you that it happened at random. It would imply just the opposite if you're thinking and if you're honest about it, etc. But Mr. Darwin and his followers have succeeded in convincing people worldwide that, oh, no, when you see that kind of extraordinary order and packed with information, oh, that should make you think random series of events, not intelligent design. So I have to give it to Mr. Darwin. He really pulled one off there. Now, again, none of that means it's true or not true, but I think it's worthy of you noticing that this is not the way science is usually done. And I want you to think about that. Look at I just grabbed the first four items I came to. A book, actually, it probably says a lot. These are the first four things I came to. A book, a candy bar, a scientific calculator, and a little soccer ball that you can flip in your hands for hours on end, if you had time. All right, it probably tells you a lot about my thinking patterns, etc. All right, but it's fine. I could have grabbed anything at all. Of the items you see in that picture, how many of those do you reasonably think came into being without any design or intelligent intervention? How about none of them? Okay, you'd have to be either pretty much an idiot or just blatantly dishonest to look me in the eye and tell me, yeah, I think two of those, maybe three, probably came into being without any human involvement or any intelligent involvement. You know better. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. When you have a ball that's inflated to a certain amount and it's made out of a material that makes it bounce and just makes it irresistible to play with, and it's painted in a pattern kind of like a soccer ball or volleyball, etc., you think that happened? No, I think there was a factory somewhere in China that cranks those out by the millions every day to exact specifications. Do you think that TI-30 scientific calculator with all its just wonderful functions, etc., You think that happened by itself? No, you know it didn't. How about the Snickers bar with almonds? That one is. That didn't happen by accident. Oh, but what a beautiful thing it is. But no, there's a factory that makes those, and they make them in a very precise way, and they've got huge multi-million-dollar machines that crank out Snickers bars precisely to the specifications that they have designed into it, with the exact ingredients, etc., and they got it right, okay? The book on the right-hand side, some people theorize that Truman Capote actually wrote it, but anyway, it's got Harper Lee's name on it, and it's out of 300 and some odd pages, etc., of sentences that make sense and convey information very precisely. Okay, you get the point. You know very well that none of those things happened without quite a lot of intelligent human effort. So, why would you then look at something far more complex, far more precisely ordered and say, yeah, couldn't have been any design effort there? I'm pretty sure that happened by a series of random events. Now, maybe it did. Not saying at this point that it didn't. I'm just making this point. By no means would that be your first and most reasonable inference. In fact, the implication of design, when you see something very intricately ordered and assembled, the implication of design is so strong and so universally the correct explanation that, as our lawyer friends might say, there's almost a burden of proof, a heavy burden of proof, if you want to convince me that it happened any other way. You know what I mean? You know, you're going to have a pretty good explanation to get me to believe that there was not intelligent design involved in that. Can I tell you, even the good folks who run the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, listening to the galaxy out there, hoping, waiting to hear a signal from anywhere that would indicate intelligent life, and guess what? They use common sense. Because if they hear background static, and for those of you who can remember when TV sets were analog and you actually had to tune them, and you saw what we called snow on the picture, that was no signal, static, etc. And then if you tuned it over a little bit and you saw a picture of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz or Andy Griffith and Opie, etc., well, that was pretty good indication that you had tuned in to a frequency where somebody very intentionally built a transmitting station and was playing, I'm not sure if it's intelligent content, but at any rate, highly precise, ordered information. You knew that didn't happen by accident. You knew there was design behind it. The people at the SETI program, they look for ordered patterns of information. They haven't found one yet after decades and decades of listening, but that's okay. But they have algorithms when they receive anything to say, is this an ordered informational signal? Because if it is, that would tell us it came from intelligent life. Well, that's a valid principle. You see ordered, complex, precise information, there's a very strong implication that came from intelligent design. If you want to think otherwise, you're going to have to really have some pretty solid reason to think otherwise. Now again, I'm not telling you it couldn't happen. I'm just telling you by no means is random events the first and most likely explanation that ought to come to your mind. So Darwin and his devotees have really kind of pulled off a good one there to say, oh no, when we see highly complex information and structure, that should make us think series of random events, and we will not consider any idea of intelligent design from any superior entity. All right, here's the second reason that the evolutionary theory is treated like no other in history. The hypothesis was initially put forth by Mr. Darwin without any actual proposed mechanism at all. None. He didn't even say, I think this is how it happened. He just said, it was a series of gradual changes that accumulated, etc. There was no proposed mechanism. Now, I'll cut him some slack for this. He could not possibly have known what mechanism to put on it, even as a proposed mechanism. They just didn't know those things then. But the scientific method really says you put forth a hypothesis, there really ought to be some idea how you claim that it happened. This one was put forth with none at all. But now, here's what's really interesting. 160 years later, there still is no precise proposed mechanism and sequence for it. You say, oh, well, yeah, there is. He said, genetic mutations. Yeah. Which genetic mutations? Well, whichever ones, happened. It is aggravatingly vague, even to this day, that it's kind of a magic theory of, we don't have to get down in the weeds of trying to figure out what became what or anything. It just happened, and it happened this way. Well, again, okay, I'll get past that because we'll look at it and evaluate it for whether it makes sense that it did happen or didn't. But it's kind of disappointing for a scientific theory or hypothesis for there to be no idea of exactly what the precise proposed sequence might be. Now, you can propose a sequence or mechanism, and you might get it wrong, and you might refine, et cetera, and that's fine. That's scientific inquiry. But you ought to at least say, well, I think it might be happening exactly this way, and I think the intermediate form might have been this, not just some vague idea of, well, it could have happened, maybe, you could get this from this. Science usually demands a lot more precision and a lot more specificity than that. But no, not this theory. All right, well, the third one. And this is actually a big one. The hypothesis initially, when Darwin put it forth, was completely unfalsifiable. We've talked about that. The idea is, if a proposal, hypothesis, if there's no way to potentially test it and it doesn't have to be direct experimentation, but if there's no way to test it or potentially disprove it, potentially show it to be false, okay? If there's no way to do that, then you should be really, really wary of that hypothesis, because that's kind of what we call, magic theories, things that you have to believe, and there's no way you can verify whether I'm telling you the truth or not. You just have to accept it because there's no way to know. Yeah, you should be really, really wary of things like that. Well, when Darwin originally put this theory forth, it was completely unfalsifiable. There was no way to certainly prove it or support it, other than he said, I think it happened. There was no way to prove it wrong. Now, normally, if something is put forth and there is truly no way to potentially falsify it, we kind of mark that one off and say, nice idea, but we can't give it serious consideration. Well, this one was just widely accepted anyway. You just had to believe it. Okay, and now listen, I'm very sensitive to the idea that a lot of people think that's what belief in a superior entity is. Believe me, we're going to come back and talk about that in detail because it deserves an answer, okay? But I'm just telling you, I'm probably agreeing with you that there ought to be some way to potentially falsify, to potentially test and disprove something if you're going to give it serious consideration. Well, this one was just accepted anyway. There was no way to falsify it. Now, I will tell you that given all of our advances in scientific knowledge since then, there now is a way to potentially falsify it, and we're going to definitely delve into that in our coming discussions, as we must. So it is now falsifiable, but initially it was not, and it was just accepted anyway. Not immediately by everyone, but it wasn't long before everybody said, oh yeah, this is what happened. You even have textbooks stating it as fact. How did that happen? When did it become a fact? In fact, as you will see, that might be a little presumptuous as we get into some of the evidence. All right, here's a fourth reason that this one, in my thinking, is like no other scientific theory in history. It is this, that those who adhere to this theory generally eagerly seek to squash and disqualify the competing hypothesis. That is, the idea that there could be a superior entity who designed and created. It is, to me, telling that those who would adhere to this theory, they can't stand, not everybody, you don't put everybody in one basket, but this is the prevailing mode. I will tell you, I am being completely fair in this analysis. They cannot stand anybody giving actual consideration to the idea that there might be a superior entity who designed and created. It's like, no, that must not even be mentioned. I've read to you some of the quotes about this, and it's not that I found one guy who was kind of loon. No, he represents the mainstream. Some of the quotes I've given you, he was just the one who actually put it out there for the world to actually read and know about. The part that's usually kind of said quietly, he said it out loud. But everybody knew that's exactly what was happening anyway. There has never been a time that I know, except for, as I said, the recent phenomenon of man-made global warming, where if you dare to suggest anything other, you'll be branded with horrible names. Science denier, ignorant, criminal, etc. If you dare to question the prevailing belief. Well, this is really the other one. And for hundreds of years, this was the only one that I can think of where you're supposed to not even be allowed to think about the alternative. See, because scientific thought usually calls for embracing an honest and thorough analysis, critical analysis. Let's see if we can disprove this. If we cannot disprove it, it might be worthy of believing as true. No, not with this one. You're not supposed to look at it, and you're not supposed to, by all means, not supposed to consider the alternative to it. So if you have to, kneecap your opponent and take them out of the race in order to get ahead, there might be something wrong with your thought process, and maybe you need to ask, why can't your hypothesis stand up to critical scrutiny and comparison with an alternative? All right. Skipped one there. All right, and here's what goes hand in hand with that. The evolutionary hypothesis is avidly shielded from any real critical analysis and falsification effort. Nobody's even trying to find the chinks in it. You may see some, but nobody's even wanting, if you try to say, look, this theory's got some problems with it. No, it doesn't. You be quiet. Okay? It's that bad. And that's very unscientific in thought process. And finally, I'll tell you that the hypothesis, even today in 2020, it's still based entirely, not on evidence, but on a series of assumptions, which are themselves dubious, actually, quite uncertain, to say the least. And that's what most people just, I've never seen anybody else really address it as such. But you need to realize what's going on with this theory as we then get in to dig into the evidence of it. This theory, like nothing else I've ever seen in science, is based completely on a series of, I broke it down into what I can identify as 5 very audacious assumptions. And that's where we will pick up next week. I really appreciate your joining us this evening. And by the way, if you're watching this live, it's August the 16th of 2020. Thank you for the privilege of getting to spend this time with you. I hope what we're looking at is helpful and profitable to you. And until we come together again, I wish you the very best in the coming week. Have a good evening.
Thank you for joining us online. Please join us again for our next service. Worship services are in person and online Sunday mornings at 8:15 and 10 o'clock. Masks are required at the 8:15 service. Masks are strongly recommended at the 10 o'clock service. Bible study is online only Sunday evenings at 5 o'clock. Summer series is online only Wednesday evenings at 6:30. You can also watch our daily devotionals and other special presentations on Facebook at the Creve Hall COC Videos page. Again, thank you